So in this chapter, I want to talk about the part of the journey that requires finding a surrogate. And so I have devoted multiple lessons to finding a surrogate. And so this one is more of an overview of the pros and cons of the ways to find a surrogate. So in chapters 5 and 6, I go into more detail about both of these methods to find a surrogate and how you can make the most of it. So what are these two methods? So there's two main ways to find a surrogate, either through your own social network or through an agency. Surrogates do have to meet certain medical requirements, which I talk about in the next chapter, but typically women have to be between 21 and 40 and who have been pregnant before. They love being pregnant and they had no issues in being pregnant. So these are all the basic requirements in order for a woman to be a surrogate. It may sound simple at first, but actually what you'll find out is that it's really hard to find a surrogate and find a woman who meets all of these requirements and who is actually willing to carry a child for an intended parent. Finding a surrogate through an agency or independently each has its pros and cons. So let's start with an agency. In theory, a surrogacy agency finds a compatible and eligible surrogate who suits the intended parent's personality and vice versa. It's important to note that most of the time, agencies have to go and find these surrogates and they don't just have them waiting on call. So that means that the demand for surrogates is actually much higher than the supply. So if you're an intended parent, don't be surprised if you have to wait a few months in order to find an eligible surrogate through an agency. Agencies also manage and direct the surrogate and intended parents through the different steps of surrogacy. The agency is there to tell both the intended parents and the surrogate what the next step of the process should be. Any questions that an intended parent or surrogate has is usually funneled through the agency. And lastly, agencies are there to emotionally support all the parties involved, but practically speaking, they are more supportive for the surrogate than for intended parents. So when you're looking for an agency, whether you're an intended parent or a surrogate, you may believe that you need to pick an agency that is headquartered or stationed in your particular city. However, the truth is that many of these surrogacy agencies have surrogates and intended parents all over the US because they can search and screen for surrogates virtually and from a distance. This isn't the case with smaller agencies, which tend to have a smaller pool of localized surrogates. So if you go with a small agency and you want a surrogate that lives near you, your best bet is to find a smaller surrogacy agency nearby. Surrogacy agencies like to find surrogates in surrogate-friendly states like California, Washington, or Oregon. So many times, no matter which surrogacy agency you decide on, they will have some surrogates in one of these states. The last thing that I want to note for any surrogate that is planning on using an agency for her journey, surrogates should not have to pay for anything. So the only thing that you're expected to do is that during the journey, you're expected to prepay for some of the expenses, like the medical insurance expenses that may pop up. But eventually, everything should be reimbursed to you. So if you are dealing with any agency that is asking you to pay for anything, just run. So now I want to talk about the pros and cons of using a surrogacy agency. So let's talk about the pros first. So the most obvious pro of using a surrogacy agency is that intended parents can outsource the surrogate search and direct all questions to the agency. So it is the agency's responsibility to go out and find a suitable surrogate for the intended parents. Another pro of using a surrogacy agency is that agencies can provide guidance and recommendations on lawyers, fertility clinics, and even escrow accounts. So escrow accounts is the account that the intended parents use to prepay a lot of the surrogate compensation. And this escrow account holds a lot of the money that will be used during the journey. We'll talk about that more later. And finally, agencies can serve as intermediaries if conflicts or touchy conversations arise between intended parents and surrogates. So naturally, there are some obviously tough conversations that arise in any surrogacy journey. how many embryos to transfer, what to do if the baby has a chromosomal abnormality. But there's also many smaller things that may be touchy. So for example, now we have to deal with COVID. And it could be that some intended parents are uncomfortable with a surrogate traveling for any kind of vacation when she's 20 weeks pregnant, for example. And even without COVID, some intended parents may feel uncomfortable with a surrogate if their partner recently picked up smoking. So what do you do in that case? So having an intermediary, having this third person can be really helpful if having these kinds of conversations is hard for you, whether you're a surrogate or your intended parent. And of course, my examples are about intended parents having problems with surrogates, but there's plenty of reasons why surrogates could have problems with intended parents as well. Maybe intended parents are asking for too much in terms of communication, and that's really posing a big problem for the surrogate. All right, so now let's talk about the cons. So the one major one that we all know is the fee. So on average, agency fees are about $22,000. But they can range anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 depending on the agency. So there's a lot of variation when it comes to agencies. Agencies may also receive hidden referral fees from the recommendations on lawyers or escrow accounts. So that's something important to keep in mind. So having these hidden referral fees is a conflict of interest. They're recommending people to you because they get some compensation for it if you decide to go with these people. The third thing to keep in mind when considering an agency is that intended parents don't always get what they pay for. So for example, an intended parent cannot assume that just because they're paying $50,000 for an agency fee that they would get better service or a better surrogate, whatever that means, and we'll talk about that, than one that costs $10,000. So there's not really a correlation between agency fee and the quality of service that an intended parent or surrogate would receive. The last thing is that the matching process can take a really long time depending on the agency. So intended parents should not be alarmed if they are asked to wait at least 3 months. These are normal waiting times. And so if an intended parent is not going to use an agency to find a surrogate, then they must go through an independent, or what the industry calls an Indy, surrogacy journey. And so an independent surrogacy journey is when intended parents or the surrogates find each other using their own social network. So all of the agency's tasks, such as finding lawyers, managing difficult conversations, these now become the responsibility of the intended parents and surrogate. So when we discuss the pros and cons of doing an independent surrogacy journey, the most obvious pro is the lack of agency fees, which automatically saves you, on average, $22,000, which is a lot of money. But with this pro comes a variety of cons, which is very important for an intended parent and a surrogate to consider. So first, the one major con is that intended parents and surrogate must find each other. So this search may be easy, and this will become easier the larger the social network of the intended parent or surrogate, or it becomes very difficult. And so especially for people who do not have a big social network around them, for example, if they're living in a city where their family doesn't live, they don't know many people, they're very busy at work. For these types of intended parents, it becomes harder to find a surrogate. The second major con about doing an independent journey is that both the intended parents and surrogate have to put more work in order to manage their journey. So they have to find the lawyers involved, they need to research what the next steps are going to be, and they have to deal with the difficult conversations. So they have to take it upon themselves, both as the intended parent and surrogate, to have these awkward conversations that an agency otherwise would handle. And finally, to reiterate this point, intended parents and surrogates then lose the support of an agency representative. And as I mentioned, an agency representative, one of their major benefits, in addition to finding a surrogate on behalf of intended parents or vice versa, is that they play a buffering role. And this can be very useful depending on the type of personality a surrogate and or intended parent has. An important thing to consider if you're an intended parent doing an independent surrogacy journey is that there's no clear advantage to the surrogate to going independent. At least with an agency, she has the support of the agency, which can be a really nice thing. That's why there are so many surrogates that are attracted to agencies. So as an intended parent, I would encourage you to be a bit creative in the way that you attract surrogates to go through an independent journey with you. So one example, and the most obvious one, is to offer a little bit more money to the surrogate than she would get with an agency. So if you're an intended parent or surrogate and you are seriously considering doing a surrogacy journey and you don't know which path to choose, keep in mind that it is a very hard decision, and the decision is highly personalized to your own situation. So independent journeys make more sense if you have a larger social network and you have more experience with surrogacy, and maybe you even know somebody who used to be a surrogate or an intended parent. These circumstances make it more obvious that maybe an independent journey makes more sense to you. On the other hand, if you're very quiet, you're in a brand new city, you don't know many people, then maybe going through an agency makes a little bit more sense. No matter what, the decision is very difficult and very highly personalized. As I talked about in the previous slides, there is no clear advantage for a surrogate to do an independent journey because they lose the support of the agency rep and they don't pay for anything anyways. So intended parents looking for a surrogate to engage in an independent journey should offer something compelling. So in Chapter 6, I'll talk about more details on how to effectively evaluate agencies. So what are the questions you should ask? What are the normal things that agencies offer, etc. And in Chapter 5, I will provide more details like which Facebook groups to join, what are some other groups to join if you're looking for an intended parent or surrogate, if you decide that an independent journey is for you.